right, I just pulled my starter out of the refrigerator. It had been in there for about 2 or 3 days, and you can keep a starter in the fridge for about a week at the most without feeding it, and it will slow down the bacteria. So I'm going to feed it this morning. I have not been discarding any of this starter in between feedings, which is why it's gotten pretty big. I'm getting ready to do a really big batch of bread, so I actually just want to double what I have right here. When you are doing your feedings, you are doing a 1:1:1 ratio of starter, water, and flour by weight. So I'll zero this out here and start out with the starter and see how many grams I have. And however many grams there are of starter, I want to put that same number of grams of flour in, and then the same number of grams of water. All right, we have a little more flour here. 779. Oh, all right. 839. Went just a little bit over, but it's okay if you're not exact. The goal here is to get the right consistency with your starter, and that doesn't always mean perfect measurements. And then I'm going to use room temperature filtered water to bring it up to that 1200, and we'll say 1240. Okay, that should work out pretty well. And I'm going to mix this up really well and let it sit for 4 to 8 hours, and it'll be ready to use in my bread. Yeah, I want you to see a close-up of the consistency. I have not finished stirring this yet, but that gives you an idea of about what it looks like when you're not finished stirring. So I will say that it is bigger in this bowl than I anticipated before I fed it, and I'm going to transfer it to a bigger container because over the next 4 to 8 hours after you feed your starter, it is actually going to rise and fall and nearly double in volume when it's at its highest level of rise. So if I leave this in this container, there is potential that it will overflow and seep onto the counter, and I want to avoid a mess. Now that we have it in the bigger container, we have plenty of room for the starter to rise and fall. And I also find it pretty helpful to make sure that the edges of the bowl are nice and clean so that when you come to check on it later, you can actually see a small line on the side from how high your starter rose. It also just helps to keep the starter clean over time as you're transferring it. And if you're going to leave your starter out on the counter, you don't have to seal it airtight. You just need to cover it with a lid or some plastic wrap or a towel, and it will be fine on the counter like that. All right, our starter has sat for as long as it needs to. It's looking really good. I'll give you all of the ingredients for 1 loaf of bread. I'll be making an extra big batch today, so my proportions are going to look a little different. But for each loaf, you want to do 1 1/4 cups of distilled water, 3/4 of a cup of starter, 1 tablespoon of honey, 1 1/2 to 2 teaspoons of salt, depending on how salty you like your bread. I usually go with about 2 teaspoons. And initially, 2 cups of flour. We will be adding more flour after this step. So what I usually do with the water in the starter is I take one of these big measuring cups and fill it up to 1 1/4 cups with water, and then I add the starter into the water until the line gets up to the 2-cup mark. And that is enough for 1 loaf of bread. An additional note on the salt that I'm using today is less salty, I would say, than your typical iodized table salt. So take that into consideration when you're deciding how much salt you want to use. You can do anything from 1 1/4 teaspoons to 2 teaspoons. I've added all my ingredients to the bowl, and I am going to do an initial stir on this just to where all of the flour is wet. All right, I feel like I've stirred this up well for the first step. After this first stir is done, we're going to let it sit for 20 minutes with a towel over it. And then we're going to be adding an additional 1¼ cup of flour per loaf. Okay, the initial stir has sat for 20 minutes, and now I'm going to add an additional 1¼ cup of flour. I'm going to do another stir on this before I put this on my KitchenAid mixer with my dough hook. I've mixed this with the spatula until a lot of the flour has gotten combined in with the wet dough, and that gets it to the point where I can add the dough hook onto it and get the KitchenAid kneading this for 10 minutes. If you don't have a KitchenAid mixer, you can do this part by hand. It's just a little more tiring, but you'll need to knead this dough for 10 minutes. We're seeing a great consistency here. In this portion of the process, you can actually add a little bit of flour or a little bit of water as needed if the dough isn't coming away from the edges of the bowl, as you can see here. As it's kneading for 10 minutes, it's not uncommon for me to sprinkle a little bit of flour in here and there just to make sure that it doesn't get too sticky on the bottom and start to come apart. I just realized I had my kneading time wrong. You actually need to knead it for 5 minutes, not 10 minutes. After kneading your dough for 5 minutes, find a large bowl. I like to use this wood bowl, but you can use glass or plastic, whatever you have. Spray the inside of the bowl or rub it down with oil. You can use olive oil, vegetable oil, some kind of nonstick spray. And then we're going to put the dough in here and let it sit covered for 15 minutes. All right, our dough has sat for 15 minutes covered, and now we're gonna go into what is called the stretch and folds portion of the recipe. So for every 15 minutes, 4 times, we are going to do this process called stretching and folding. And what this does is it builds up the elasticity in the dough. It adds air bubbles to it, improves the texture, and the longer it sits, the easier it is to stretch multiple times. So I usually stretch it and fold it over about that many times, kind of roll it into a little ball and put it right back in the bowl, cover it up again, and we'll do it again in another 15 minutes. So like I said, we're going to do it every 15 minutes, 4 times. And then beyond that, it's going to depend on your time available and the amount of patience that you have available. The very nice woman who taught me how to do this told me that you should do like 6 to 8 stretch and folds after the initial 4. I usually end up doing about 2. So my first stretch and folds are 4 stretch and folds once every 15 minutes, and then I'll do, 1 or 2 more every hour or so. And then that's usually good enough for me to just shape it and bake it. All right, so we've been doing a bunch of rising. It's the next morning. I had decided that I was going to leave my dough out overnight because I had it pretty cold in here, and it obviously rose quite a bit. Normally I would recommend that someone put it in the fridge if the process ends up going overnight and then pull it out the next day. It's also important to plastic wrap it so that the air doesn't dry out the top layer of your dough. These are both double batches, so I dumped this one out of the bowl here and I cut it in half, and I'm going to go into the shaping phase. So I flip it out of the bowl and then I pull all of the edges in because we're trying to go for a bit of a ball shape. I'm gonna shape it and put it back into the bowl to rise for a little while. I also have the oven preheating right now at 430 degrees. I put the stone Dutch oven that I use in to the oven because that has to preheat for about 30 minutes in the oven at temperature so that when you put the dough in it, it's nice and hot and it can start baking right away. So I've got him more shaped. What I do is I pull the edge, pinch it down in the middle, okay, and then I'll flip him over and kind of shape him, tuck his edges in just a little bit more. Normally someone would use a regular flour to do some dusting at this point, but I don't want to do that for these loaves, so instead I'm using a little bit of nonstick spray to keep them from sticking to my cutting board. So this little guy is going to be going in the oven soon. Right before I put it in the oven though, I'm going to use my very sharp knife to slice a cut or maybe two cuts, whatever pretty pattern I want to do, along the top before I put it into the Dutch oven so that it will steam as it's baking and get a nice rise to it. Alright, so I reshaped this guy. I tucked all of the edges in. I popped any really big obvious bubbles on the side and stuck him back in the bowl for now. I have separated the dough into 4 loaves and used the bowls that I had at hand. I have a couple proofing baskets, so I have those going. I'm going to cover these with a towel and let them sit for a while. And it will be interesting to see if some of them are a lot bigger than the other ones due to the amount of time they have to rise in between the bakings. Lovely. Look at these guys rising very nicely. We're going to stick one in the oven. My Dutch oven has been preheated and pulled out, ready to go. I've put one of the loaves onto some parchment paper, and now I'm going to give it a little slice. I will do a pretty pattern here. All right, and I'm going to lift this, put it into the Dutch oven very carefully, put the lid back on, and put it in the oven. I like to push the edges of the paper down so that they aren't as close to the element. And she is in. I'm going to bake this covered for 24 minutes, and then I'll be taking the lid off and baking it for an additional 17 minutes. Oh, isn't that looking so lovely? And now we're going to bake it for an additional 17 minutes uncovered. All right, oh, and there she is. Look at how beautiful. We need to let this cool for about an hour before we cut into it. But man, look at how great it turned out. Nice and crispy on the outside. And my very favorite way to enjoy this is toasted with a lot of butter, of course. Right, well, I just rolled right into getting my next loaf in the oven, and I'm going to keep going on this process, but I hope that you find this video super helpful and it doesn't feel too complex. Sourdough is actually very forgiving, so even if you don't follow all of these instructions exactly, still go for it and give it a try because you're probably going to get a tasty result.